on your domestic sewing machine. I just said that all wrong. I am here to teach you how to quilt your quilt on your domestic sewing machine. That is so funny. Anyways, I'm so excited to see you guys. Let me know where you guys are from. Let me know if you're a quilter. Let me know if you make quilt tops and then actually try to quilt them on your domestic sewing machine. Share your tips and tricks that work great for you. And let me know all the different details and different tips and things that you do. Are you someone that generally makes a quilt top and then loves the way a long arm quilter does it? So you send it out to your long arm quilter. Does your long arm quilter have a wait list? Let me know all the different things. I've got 2 different cameras here. Well, I've got actually 3 different cameras, but I wanted to let you know that with this video, I'm trying to go ahead. Hi, Liz. Hello, Amanda. I got to talk to Amanda this morning, and I've got an email to send to her. But let's go ahead and talk about quilting. So before we get to quilting the quilt, we are doing this one with the domestic sewing machine. We are actually going to do this one, which is 20 inches by 20 inches, with the, we're going to be layering this and doing it with a hand quilting technique, because I want to go over hand quilting techniques, and we're going to change a little bit about how we layer and base this quilt too. So I can't wait to show you. The pattern that we're using to share these techniques is the Live Well, Live Strong quilt. We've been doing a sew along. And with the sew along, we've made this sampler quilt, and some people have made it in the standard size right here that I'm going to share with you. It's 60 by 60 inches. It's hanging behind me. Some people have made it in the negative space layout right here, and we also have the pattern works for a bed runner too. So hi, Elizabeth. I'm so glad that you're here live. I'm so glad that you're getting yours out now. One of the things that I do want to share, hi Belle, that I do want to share with you guys that's super important is the biggest trick to having a successful experience while domestic machine quilting your quilt is that you get it prepared a proper way, and that your layering is done in such a way that you don't have puckering. You won't have to worry about anything, because when you are quilting your quilt on your domestic machine, you just want to think about the rhythm of how you're pushing the quilt through. Okay. Hi, Jane. It's so good to see you. You want to think about how you're pushing the quilt through. Do you have like a regular rhythm of pushing the quilt through? You don't want to be thinking, oh, is it folding over underneath? Is it doing this? Is it doing that? So I've done some videos on how to layer your quilt and how to get a good layer down. Now, so I want to talk about that really fast. Oh, I lost my little piece of batting, but that's okay. So my method that I use is I use a big piece of plywood, okay? And I take it out put it on a card table. I put it outside on my patio. I do whatever I need to do. I put it up someplace, and I've had this piece of plywood. It's 1/4 of an inch thick, so it's not that expensive to purchase. And then and you can have the Home Depot or the warehouse or wherever you're getting your plywood from, cut it. So mine is cut 4 by 6 feet. Okay. I use binding clips, and I systematically put my backing on. I systematically clamp this backing from Finland. It's so good to see you guys. So tell me how you guys like to layer your quilts, because you just need to make sure you've got a good layer. But I use these binding clips to clamp it on to the back of the quilt, the batting of the quilt, to the plywood, and the quilt top. Okay, so that's how I secure my quilt top, so that I'm not on the floor and dreading that job of being on the floor and worried about my animals walking on it, or worried about my kids walking over it, or who knows what. Okay, so I'm trying to alleviate anxiety there. I use a little bit of 505 spray. We're talking a little bit, just to kind of have confidence as we're layering it that everything is laying nice and flat and it's doing great. Okay. Then I go and I safety pin my quilt. Okay. So I do want to show you guys some thread basting techniques which is what we're going to do on this one. We're going to thread baste it so that you don't, if you feel like this is dreadful, the safety pins, there are other options. There is thread basting. There are lots of other options, and I use my painter's tape. What is absolutely important though is that you've got a perfect, or not a perfect, but the most amazing quilt sandwich, okay? If you have a really good quilt sandwich, then you're gonna have a great experience quilting it on your domestic sewing machine, okay? So you wanna set yourself up for success, and the best way to set yourself up for success is to actually have your quilt sandwich prepared really well. Okay, so we talked about this last week, and I'm going to switch the camera view, but you can see on here, this particular quilt, let's hold up this small piece right here. This particular quilt is a sampler quilt, and it doesn't have particular lines. We could stitch in the ditch for this quilt, which would be just fine. I'll move over here so that little window isn't over my head, but we could stitch in the ditch with this quilt, and that would be fine. But a random pattern, which is what we're doing on here, where we just do straight stitches across, but we're not having them be perfectly straight, because I want you guys to have a good positive experience quilting on your domestic sewing machine without worrying that every single stitch has to be perfectly straight. I want you to focus on that your stitches are consistent in length, okay? Focus on that. Focus on how you're flowing it through and those types of things. So the pattern of how we're long arming or quilting this is like this quilt right here. So you can see this is the same quilt pattern, the Live Well Live Strong quilt pattern, which you can get at stitchesquilting.com. But this is the bed runner, okay? And I have quilted this in the same way. These lines are not perfect lines at all, okay? They're not perfect lines, and they're not perfectly straight, all right? And then we have this occasional gentle wave that goes through it. So when you quilt and you're just not having to be absolutely perfect with your lines, okay, that takes some pressure off as you're pushing it through, and it feels awkward and heavy, okay? And I'm using my smaller sewing machine, so I've got a smaller area here to quilt. I think the other thing that's really important is also, so pick out your quilt design for your first experience intentionally so that you can have a positive experience. The other thing that's really important is using a batting that has a thin loft. So you want to purchase something that's like an 80-20 or 100% cotton or whatever that has a thin loft. This 80-20 is wool and cotton, so you've got some warmth with this. So depending on where you live, but get a thin loft so it's not super huge and bulky for you to push through your domestic sewing machine. Does all that make sense? I hope those are some really good quick tricks or quick tips. So the next thing that we're gonna do is, because this quilt is, we're going to just go one direction, okay? So since we are going one direction with this quilt all the way, yes, Elizabeth, I'd love to talk thread colors. I love to talk thread colors. It's one of my most favorite things is thread colors, okay? And so thank you for asking that question. You guys ask lots of questions. But let me give you this other tip here. Because this quilt we are just doing one direction all the way across, okay? We are not going horizontal on this quilt. We don't have to worry about that the backing puckering up. We don't have to worry about, so really this quilt pattern is also your secret sauce to start experimenting using your domestic quilting machine, sewing machine, to quilt your quilts, okay? So this type of pattern is really a good one to experiment with, and I've got a ton here for you to look at. I do this pattern on my long arm sewing machine. I freehand it, you know what I mean? I don't have a computerized machine, and I use it on my regular sewing machine because I've just had such beautiful luck. And all of you guys that are regular followers, you see this, okay? You see me using this pattern all the time, and I'm sorry, I'm boring. But I really, as you learn, this is a great pattern to learn from. Has anybody used this technique that you guys have been here for like super long and following? Share if you use this technique and if you had a problem with the backing or things like that. So because we're going with one direction, we're not crossing over our seams, you are really not going to have puckering, okay? So, and because of that, you don't necessarily have to start at the center of the quilt. So on this, when you're quilting along, remember you're going to have your quilt rolled up. So one side's, this is foundation paper pieced, by the way, you guys. So there's paper on the back. We're going to take all the paper out before we quilt this. Okay, but we did this one as 20 inches and 20 inches square. And but it's all part of that pattern. It's included in the pattern. So what we are doing is we are rolling up our quilt like this. So I want to give you guys a perspective. So when you are pushing this through your sewing machine, you don't always know that you're making the perfect straight line, right? As you're pushing that through, you don't have perspective per se. And since this is a sampler quilt, you don't have the perspective of those rows of quilt blocks going along your quilt. So in this situation, I will start sometimes at the top, I will start at the bottom, and I will also start in the middle, okay? Because we're not crossing any of our lines. We're just simply going across. You're going to cross it with a gentle wave. Does that make sense? Hi, Robin. Thank you for the tips. You're going to cross it with a gentle wave, but you're really close with everything that you're doing, okay? So that's why when you use the layering technique and have confidence that your quilt is laid out really, really well, and I safety pinned and I did a little bit of spray adhesive. I don't have any problem with my needle gumming up or anything with the amount of spray adhesive that we're using. Okay, so also when you long arm quilt a quilt, and being a long armer, I don't start in the middle of the quilt. A long armer always starts at the top, the bottom, or the side based on how the quilt is loaded onto the machine. You don't start at the middle of a quilt, okay? So that's another thing to kind of share with you there. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back. Are any of you guys long armer quilters right there? And do you guys use long arm quilters? Let me know about that. I'm going to answer some thread colors. Because sometimes if you have a long armer, and I don't long arm for people, so yes, Jane, I am going one direction. No. Okay, so yeah, good question, Jane. Jane just asked, do you go in one direction only and turn and go back the opposite way? Okay, so let me show you this. That's a great question. I'm wondering if I could do that, demonstrate that. Let me grab a smaller quilt that we've done with this pattern. I think this one works out great. Okay, so here we go. This is we all made this quilt. It's a free pattern at Stitches Quilting, but this is, what is this quilt? It's Healthcare Heroes. Okay, Healthcare Hero Heart Quilt. And you can make it in really large, you can make it this size, or make it as a pillow cushion. So let's go ahead and answer that question with this right here. So, but I kind of feel like I should bring down my camera a little bit. Okay, so what you're going to do. So Jane is asking, did I always go through my sewing machine? I need to tilt my camera down just a little bit. So just one moment, because I want you guys to be able to see. I'm going to get a little close, and hopefully I don't bump it too much. I want you guys to be able to see my mat. Okay, perfect. Okay, can't see my head, which is fine. We don't need to see my head. So you can see here, I'm pushing this quilt through right here. Okay, and pretend like this is the large quilt. I can then, because I have this rolled up, and if this is a large quilt, you're going to have a pretty large roll over here, and you're going to have a pretty large roll over here. Okay, so I am going this direction. If you have your quilt layered just beautifully, okay, you can quilt the top of this and roll this up. Okay, if you've got a really good layer, it depends on your quilt sandwich. You can then turn this around I do this all the time. Turn this around, but I have got good quilt sandwich layers. I can quilt it this way, okay? And then when I come to the center, I can quilt this way, stop the thread, and then just keep going that direction, or come this direction on the center. So you can really pull that either way. Let me show you another example where I have shifted. Okay, this is the We're All in This Together quilt. It's a pattern at Stitches Quilting. This quilt right here, what I did is I would literally quilt it, and this is that same ding dong technique, okay, that I drive everybody crazy with, but same technique. Do you see how good it looks? But I go ahead and I quilt on this side, all right, and since I know my sandwich is really good, this is a smaller project, I will go ahead and go here, and then I pivot my this, and then I will turn it around. Okay, sometimes I will actually do that, and I will pivot it, but most of the time I'm going the same direction on the top of it, and then I'll flip that around and go this other direction before. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go back to thread colors. Okay, so here's a couple little samples. I'm going to keep these rather close in case we want to hold that up again. Now, thread colors are really important, and I want to share with you guys some thread color advice. So I make sure that whatever I'm doing, my thread color, I make sure I decide my thread color and my backing about the same time. On this quilt right here and on the quilt behind me, I just used a yellow type of thread. And you can see that shade of yellow there. Let me see if I can hold it up better. But I used a yellow thread, and I laid it on top of my fabrics. Okay, and I laid it on top of like the red. And Elizabeth, you've got the most beautiful colors in your Everyone Can Quilt group. I mean, your Everyone Can Quilt. And they're just beautiful, beautiful jewel tones and bright, bright colors. So look at something like a yellow. Look at something like a pale, say a pale green or a pale pink, maybe. When I see your quilt, oh, I love those pinks, or the purples. The purples I absolutely adore in your quilt. So, but just maybe a paler shade of that purple, the pink, the yellow, and just unravel it a little bit and lay it down on the fabrics and just kind of debut your thread with the fabrics, okay? And then what you want to do is also select your fabric for your backing based on your front of your quilt and your quilting that you're doing, okay? So right here, I am using this backing right here that is an aqua color, and I am using a very light blue thread with this backing, okay? So you can see it looks absolutely beautiful on the back. So you can see those stitches. And on the front, doesn't it look, let's look at it across the top here. Look at that thread, that light blue thread on all of that stitching. None of it just really pops out and distracts you from the quilt. We're really showcasing the quilt blocks and all of the fabric. So do you see what that looks like? So Elizabeth, are you still there? So is that some good advice about thread? Because sometimes picking thread can be a little overwhelming. Okay, let's go back to our quilting. So we started up at the top of this, and the other thing is why I use a little bit of spray adhesive is I don't want to overload my quilt top with so many safety pins that eventually it's so heavy, it's like you're miserable pushing it through your sewing machine, okay? So everybody can see I've got a really narrow throat here, okay? So let's go ahead. We started up here at the top with our lines going across, and then we did our gentle wave in there, okay? So we've just got a nice gentle wave, all right? And then I pulled it into the center, and you can see these lines going down the center and our gentle wave going there. We are now going to work on this top. So, as Jane, as you asked, we are going to be going the opposite direction. So when I fed this quilt through on this side, I was going this direction. So if the quilt top is from left to right. I sewed from left to right. Ooh, my little thread came unthreaded because I'm pulling stuff around here. When I turn this around and quilt it from the bottom side, I am actually going to be going from the right to the left side. But if you have a really good quilt sandwich, you're gonna be just fine. Okay, so you want your quilt sandwich to just be perfect, if you can. Now mine's not perfect, but I know mine is perfect enough for what I'm wanting to do. And I'm not doing a very complicated pattern of quilting on this. Okay, so you can get away with a lot with this pattern. So if you're a beginning quilter, then this is a great pattern for you to work on. So once again, my machine stitch length is at a 4, which is pretty reasonable. I don't want super tight stitches necessarily. And that all has to go with your particular machine. So let's go ahead and let's roll this up. They do have things so that I can manage this pretty well when I'm pushing it through the sewing machine. Okay, so we're gonna roll up this side and we're gonna just make a beautiful roll. Have you guys seen like people using pool noodles or things like that? And things to kind of roll up their quilt. So I'm gonna get a good roll here. Let's get the roll set before we get started, okay? So take some time to prep before you start pushing it through the sewing machine, because the last thing I want to do is unpick quilting stitches, you know, of your machine quilting through all these layers, okay? We don't want to spend time unpicking. And you know what? I don't unpick very often. Okay, so I've got this rolled up and I'm ready to start. The other thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to do just a nice secure line along the top. Then I'm going to start taking out my safety pins. So let me go ahead and get going here. Okay, and let's change the camera perspective. So you can see here's the sewing machine. You can still see the view of how I'm pushing it through. Okay, you could use gloves if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and bring this along right here. This is probably, this is actually too close to the quilt. This won't be seen because it will eventually be absorbed by the binding, okay? And so we're gonna go ahead and just go right like this. The other thing is if your quilt top is nice and flat, if you have a nice flat quilt top where you've been smart about measuring your, let me get my pins so I put my pins in there as I come across them, that you're measuring and you're trimming your blocks down to the desired size of that they should be, and that you've got your quilt top nice and square and flat. That helps an awful lot to have any puckering on the top or the back. Okay, I don't want that to hit that camera tripod over there. Okay, so we can see this. So you're just going to want to push this through and just push it through. So, and you really will have just a beautiful, oh, it paused there for a minute. I was worried. Okay, so, and I'm using my sewing machine with a smaller throat space. So with this 60 by 60 inch quilt, you should be able to do that pretty easily and to be able to manage a quilt through this throat space. And I have definitely, I've had this machine for so long, I've pushed many quilts through this machine. Okay, once again, let's maybe go an inch apart, and we're just going for a gentle line along the quilt. We're not gonna worry about, and sometimes you guys, I can overthink the quilting. Who has quilt tops that, yes, I've made sure I have a little screwdriver right here. My needle is tight because when you're using your walking foot, I'm using a walking foot here. I've taken off my quilting foot. I'm using a walking foot, so that's key too. When you're using the walking foot can easily unscrew your needle screw. It's kind of going in an opposite direction. So you do want to make sure everything is screwed on tightly. All right, and use your little screwdriver. Don't go crazy and break anything, but just make sure you're screwed. So you can see I'm taking out a pin there, a safety pin, and I'm bringing this across. Okay, now who has tops that have never been quilted. I do. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of them. But please share, do you have quilt tops that have never been quilted? If you want to try out this technique, do it with a wall hanging. Do it with a pillow. And you can see my line is not perfectly straight. It's really hard to try to get perfect straight unless you're marking it. So you can mark your quilt tops if you want things super, super perfect. You can mark it with a water-soluble pen. You don't want to be pressing it though necessarily, because you might accidentally make your pen become permanent on your quilt. You can mark it with a Frixion pen, but you do want to test it out. But you don't necessarily want to have a quilt top that's completely marked and then press on top of it and have those lines become permanent, okay? So I like that this particular style of quilting also doesn't require me, okay, let's go ahead and cut that thread, doesn't require me that I have to mark my quilt top, okay? So let me tell you about my oldest, I think the absolute oldest quilt that I have that is not quilted, okay? I have a really old quilt. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of when I started that quilt. I don't know. I might have started that quilt in the year 2000. And the quilt top is finished. And it was a quilt that I made, that I was making for my grandmother. And she loves purple. I'll pull it out of my pile of quilt tops. And she loves, loves, loves purple. And I'm trying to avoid the tripod over there, so I am kind of skirting this different directions. But I made this beautiful king-size quilt top for her. And she actually didn't have a king-size bed. I do not know why I did this. I was younger. She and my grandfather slept in 2 twin beds. So anyways, but I wanted this quilt to be quilted just absolutely perfectly. And back then, I mean, I never sent anything to a long armor. I don't know, I just couldn't pay for it. I'm not sure why, but most of the quilts I make are just like for my kids and things like that. And I've only sent one to a long armor. And then when I got my long arm, I didn't feel like I was good enough yet to go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and do one more line, and then we're going to do a wave on here. Okay? So, but I never quilted the quilt top, and my grandmother passed away. Jackie, I am using a stitch length of 4. You could go a little bit smaller, but I have so Jackie asked what stitch length I'm using. I am using a stitch length of 4. You don't want to go too small with your stitch length, so definitely increase your stitch length. I know with my batting that a stitch length of 4 is going to be just fine. Also, look at the rating of your batting and the quality of batting that you purchased. Your batting bag that you purchased your batting from will say what it recommends that you quilt it. Do you quilt it every 4 inches? Do you quilt it every 6 inches? What is the quality of the batting that you're using? So you want to make sure that you're kind of staying consistent with the instructions of the batting. Some battings are a little bit higher quality than other battings. So, which it doesn't matter, just as long as it's quilted enough. Doesn't matter what batting you use. I mean, you've got old, antique, ancestral quilts out there that are still pretty good, hopefully, based on how they're taken care of. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you this. Okay, we have these lines. They are not perfect lines. When the quilt is washed, the batting will shrink. And the fabrics will shrink, especially because I don't wash my quilting cottons, okay? I own a fabric store, so I know all of my dye lots are absolutely safe. So anyways, I will put some of the color wash sheets when I wash it. Let's see here. Amanda, you've got another top, your Dresden plate that needs to be sandwiched and quilted. I love that quilt top you have of the Dresden plate. Now, do you see here I made a little bump in my line? That's just fine. None of that will be seen once this quilt is washed. And when the batting shrinks and the fabric shrinks, it will look absolutely beautiful, okay? You're not going to see any kind of differentiation. Now here, I went a little crooked here, which is just fine. We're not going to worry about it. And you can see these lines are not perfectly, maybe I'm talking too much. Look, here's another one. But you can see I kind of came up just slightly. But none of this, you will not see any of this. Here's a little bit of a bump in here. That's why I say you want to make sure your quilt sandwich is really good, because these are the kind of things you want to work on your flow of how you're feeding it into the sewing machine. Does that make sense? If you're really wanting straight lines, then I recommend you use the arm that goes on the back of your quilting foot. Now, let's do our swiveled line, our gentle wave. Okay, I'm going to start down here. Actually, let's do one more straight one, and then we'll do the swivel. I feel like we need one more straight. But what's really nice about this is you just don't notice it later on, okay? And this is just a great way to finish a quilt. So let's see here. Elizabeth says, I have a bin, but I'm working on it. I agree. We're all working on everything, right? And there's no shame in that. Sometimes we put off quilting a quilt because we don't know what thread to use, what fabric to use on the backing. Sometimes we don't know what pattern to use as the quilting of it. I'm going to take out a few more pins so I don't have to keep starting and stopping. Maybe that's my problem with my little crooked lines. So let me take out more of these pins because I know this is secure up here. It's not going to shift, all right? Sometimes we put off the quilting because we want to improve our skills. Sometimes we put off the quilting because we do not want to pay a long armor. Sometimes we put off the quilting. There's lots of different reasons why we put off the quilting. I still haven't quilted that one for my grandma. I need to do that. Okay, Amelia asked, what size of quilt am I sewing? I am sewing a quilt that is 60 by 60 inches. So this is the Live Well, Live Strong quilt pattern right here. And this one, the way it's laid out, is 60 by 60 inches. You could do this quilt a twin to king size and also as a bed runner. So, but the one that I'm particularly doing is 60 by 60 inches. And I feel like this is pretty manageable. Okay, but before I finish this, we're going to do the wavy line right now. Let me take out one more pin. And then we're going to go back to the center because I want to show you guys how I go to the center. Okay, I'm just rolling it up on both sides in order to get that center. So I want to show you guys how I do that. Let's do the wave though right now. So I want you guys to see me managing the quilt with a ton over here and a ton over here. So that's why we're going to go to the center. Okay, we're doing the wavy line, and I'm having this wavy line just go all sorts of places. I do have my needle in needle down position. So right here, because it's wobbly, it's also heavy. If your machine does not automatically have needle down, be sure to turn it over on the side so your needle is in the down position. Okay, I'm just going to go back and forth. Your wavy line does not need to be perfect. Don't overthink it. It doesn't have to just stay between two lines. Just make it organic and be consistently inconsistent. So I learned from my long arming skills, I learned from a blue ribbon gal that sometimes she makes just one quilt a year. And she'll sometimes earn like $120,000 off that one quilt for being in different quilt shows throughout the year. Okay, here we go. So you can see that's all quilted and it looks beautiful right along there. It looks absolutely beautiful. Let's go to our center. So now I'm going to roll this side of the quilt and we're going to go work on the center, and we're going to work, and I'm working this in groups so that you guys can see what it's like as you move your quilt around. So let me go ahead and get a good roll over here on this side, because we're going to take our roll. I want you guys to be able to picture what it looks like when you're in the center of your quilt. You're going to have this side rolled up, and you can have this side rolled up. If you have a big enough table, I'm filming with multiple cameras, so I don't have all the space to just let this go out. But in some ways, I think it's less heavy to have these two rolls. And then I can move the machine, move the quilt with my rolls. Does that make sense? So once again, before I hit these lines, I'm going to remove these pins right here, and I'm going to take the time to just remove some of these pins before I go to this line, and that gives you a break in your quilting process. So I actually kind of appreciate this opportunity because it takes energy to push these through your sewing machine. Not too much. I mean, it's not formidable, but you know, and I don't know why I always close all my safety pins, but I do. So let's go ahead and go down here. And remember, don't judge your quilt as you're looking at it right now. Judge your quilt after you have washed it. And don't be looking at every single little thing, all right? Let's go ahead and do another swipe right here. So you can see I've got both of my rolls right here, and I'm going to use my rolls to feed my quilt through. And I'm going to go about an inch in length between, about an inch. And sometimes I will throw in something, you know, maybe a ½ inch, or I'll throw in a little bit more than an inch in some of my lines. And I even go back to my quilt, because one thing I'll do is I'll kind of stabilize different sections of it with lines, and then I'll go back and make it thicker, my quilting. So depending on what the quilt is. I know I've definitely done that. I can show you on some of the other projects. So I'll go and I'll put in some pretty, maybe 2 or 3 inches apart, and then I go back. That way I can get all my safety pins out, and I don't have to worry about things being unstable. And then I go back and fill in more lines, okay? Because I'm only going one direction across the quilt. So I'm not going to have problems with that bunching up or with things crossing over my stitches. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that one. And then now let's go ahead and go to this other side and put another row over on this side. Because remember, I've already done some of those right there. And I'll take out some of these pins so they're not in my way later. So you can see what this is like. Does anybody have thoughts? Yes, thank you. The Dresden plate, the Dresden is really, really special to Amanda. And it is. Those squares were gifted to her. And so she actually